Flames erupted across the decks as American dive bombers struck with deadly precision. The once mighty Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, proud symbols of the Imperial Navy, were now engulfed in fire and chaos. The Battle of Midway had taken a dramatic turn, one that would change the course of the war forever. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. American bombers, flying in tight formations, soared high above the Pacific, their pilots scanning the vast blue expanse for the enemy fleet. Below them, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu continued launching aircraft, unaware of the disaster about to befall them. The intelligence gathered by American codebreakers had given the U.S. Navy a critical advantage. They knew where the enemy would be, when they would strike, and how they operated. Now it was time to act. Dive bomber squadrons from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown had been searching for the carriers all morning, and at last, their patience was rewarded. The Japanese ships were spread across the ocean, vulnerable and exposed. At nearly 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the attack group, eyes locked onto the faint silhouettes below. Fuel was running low, but he made a fateful decision to press on. His gamble paid off. A glint of sunlight reflected off the deck of a Japanese destroyer, leading him straight to the carriers. With a quick command, his squadrons adjusted course and prepared to dive. Down below, Japanese sailors moved with practiced precision, rearming and refueling aircraft for another wave of attacks on Midway. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the decks, fuel lines snaked between planes, and crews worked frantically to reload their weapons. There was no time to waste. Victory seemed close at hand, until shadows filled the sky. The first American bombers broke formation, rolling into steep dives. Their engines roared as they plunged toward the enemy fleet, noses pointed directly at their targets. Pilots gritted their teeth, adjusting their aim as anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. Tracers lit up the sky. Black smoke billowed from desperate flak bursts, and shrapnel whizzed past their cockpits. But the bombers pressed on, determined to strike. Seconds stretched into eternity as the dive bombers neared their release points. The first bomb, dropped from nearly 15,000 feet, streaked downward with deadly accuracy. It smashed into Kaga's flight deck, detonating with a force that sent flames shooting skyward. Another struck amidships, igniting fuel stores. Within moments, Kaga was ablaze. Fire spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. Planes, bombs, and men were caught in the inferno. Akagi suffered a similar fate. A well-placed bomb tore through the deck, exploding deep within the ship's hangars. The blast sent shock waves through the carrier, ripping apart steel and igniting volatile aviation fuel. Smoke poured from its hull as secondary explosions rocked the vessel. Admiral Nagumo, stationed aboard Akagi, watched in horror as his flagship burned, the once proud warship reduced to a fiery wreck. Soryu was next. A series of bombs struck its deck in quick succession, triggering massive detonations. Fire engulfed the carrier as sailors struggled to contain the blaze. Water pumped furiously into the hull, but it was no use. The inferno was unstoppable. Explosions ripped through compartments, sending debris flying in all directions. On board the carriers, chaos reigned. Sailors ran in all directions, some leaping into the ocean to escape the flames. Others fought desperately to control the fires, manning hoses and firefighting equipment in a futile effort to save their ships. The heat was unbearable, the smoke suffocating. Screams filled the air as explosions continued to rip through the decks. Above, American pilots pulled out of their dives, banking sharply to escape the rising columns of fire and smoke. The attack had been a success, but the battle was far from over. Japanese fighters, now scrambling to retaliate, swarmed the sky in search of vengeance. The air became a whirlwind of bullets and tracer rounds as dogfights erupted above the burning fleet. The damage was catastrophic. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were reduced to blazing hulks. The heart of the Imperial Navy's striking force had been gutted in a single devastating assault. The Americans had turned the tide of the Pacific War, but the full extent of their victory was yet to be realized. Flames raged across the decks of the stricken carriers, thick black smoke billowing into the sky as the infernos consumed everything in their path. The once proud warships, symbols of Japan's naval power, were now little more than floating pyres. Sailors fought desperately against the destruction, but the sheer scale of the damage made their efforts nearly impossible. On Kaga, the fire spread unchecked. Explosions erupted from deep within the ship as ammunition stores ignited, sending deadly shock waves through the steel hull. The deck, once bustling with aircraft and crew, was now a shattered wasteland of twisted metal and charred remains. Those who survived the initial blasts scrambled to escape the suffocating heat, their uniforms singed, their lungs filled with acrid smoke. Some threw themselves overboard, seeking refuge in the open sea, while others collapsed where they stood, overcome by exhaustion and burns. Akagi fared no better. The damage from the direct bomb strike had ruptured fuel lines, and flames leaped from one compartment to the next with terrifying speed. Sailors worked frantically, sealing off sections of the ship in a desperate bid to contain the inferno, but each explosion undid their efforts, tearing through bulkheads and consuming every available pocket of oxygen. A deafening blast rocked the carrier as the fire reached the aviation ordnance below deck. The resulting detonation sent debris flying skyward, a grim testament to the devastation unfolding within. Soryu's fate was sealed within minutes of the first bomb strike. The fires that tore through its interior left no chance of survival for those trapped below. Attempts to counter the destruction were short-lived as secondary explosions obliterated firefighting stations and sent burning wreckage raining down on those still trying to save the vessel. Smoke poured from every opening, turning the ship into a floating furnace. The officers on board, realizing that all hope was lost, ordered an emergency evacuation. Amid the chaos, Japanese destroyers and cruisers rushed to assist, lowering boats and preparing to take on survivors. However, the raging fires made the rescue efforts perilous. The heat rising from the burning ships was so intense that even approaching them risked igniting fuel vapors lingering on the water surface. Some sailors, struggling to stay afloat, were caught in patches of burning oil, their cries lost in the roaring flames. Others clung to floating debris, watching helplessly as their ships succumbed to the relentless destruction. In the sky above, American bombers that had delivered the crushing blows now turned toward their home carriers, their mission complete. Many of them had witnessed the destruction firsthand, their gunner positions offering an unfiltered view of the chaos below. What had once been formidable war machines were now nothing more than infernos adrift on the Pacific. The pilots, exhausted but victorious, radioed back reports of the successful strike, their voices steady but carrying the weight of what they had just seen. Despite the catastrophic losses, the remaining Japanese forces refused to surrender. Fighters that had been in the air when the attack began now returned, searching for an enemy that had already vanished beyond the horizon. With their carriers crippled, these pilots had nowhere to land. Some attempted to reach distant Japanese-held islands, while others made the grim decision to ditch their planes into the ocean rather than risk capture. Their war was over, but the humiliation of defeat weighed heavily upon them. As the fires on the carriers burned through the last remnants of their structure, the once mighty vessels began to list. Hulls, weakened by the intense heat, groaned under the strain, sections collapsing into the sea with dull, echoing crashes. The ocean, indifferent to the battle that had just taken place, swallowed the wreckage piece by piece. By nightfall, all three carriers would slip beneath the waves, leaving nothing but scattered debris and oil slicks to mark their resting places. The loss was unimaginable for the Imperial Navy. 3 of its most powerful warships, along with their elite air crews, had been destroyed in mere minutes. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in a way that could never be undone. For Japan, the road to victory had been severed. For the United States, this was only the beginning. The war would continue, but from this moment forward, the tides had turned irreversibly. The fires continued to rage long after the initial strikes, but the fate of the Japanese carriers was already sealed. The once proud warships, the backbone of the Imperial Navy's striking power, had been reduced to smoldering wrecks drifting aimlessly in the open sea. As explosions ripped through their hulls, their final moments played out in eerie silence for those watching from a distance. The battle that had begun with Japan's confidence in an overwhelming victory was now ending in disaster. As the afternoon sun bore down on the Pacific, the few survivors still aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu faced an impossible decision. The decks beneath them glowed red-hot, metal warping under the relentless heat. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, thick and choking. Some leaped into the water, grasping at floating debris, while others hesitated, staring at the towering flames before resigning themselves to their fate. Those fortunate enough to reach the waves were quickly pulled under by the relentless pull of the sinking ships or struggled against the vast oil slicks that burned across the surface. Japanese destroyers, their crews watching in horror, did what they could to save the men still clinging to life. Lifeboats were lowered, ropes tossed to those swimming desperately toward salvation. But the rescue was fraught with danger. Secondary explosions sent fragments of steel into the air, while the heat from the burning carriers made approaching too closely a deadly risk. The sea itself was turning into a graveyard, a floating mass of debris, bodies, and shattered steel. Below the waves, the damage to the carriers' hulls grew worse with each passing minute. Soryu was the first to succumb, its structure weakened beyond repair. As water rushed through every opening, it tilted sharply to one side. Within moments, the massive vessel was swallowed whole, disappearing beneath the ocean in a thunderous roar. Hundreds of men still aboard vanished with it, their screams lost to the depths. Kaga followed soon after. The flames that had devoured its deck now reached deep within its inner compartments, causing bulkheads to collapse. Smoke poured from every opening as the bow dipped beneath the waves. The ship groaned, its massive frame cracking under the pressure of the sea. Those still aboard made last, frantic attempts to escape, but few would succeed. As the ocean claimed its second victim, the water churned violently, sending ripples across the battlefield. Akagi, the pride of the Japanese fleet, lingered for a time, refusing to go down easily. Its remaining crew fought until the very last moment, dousing flames, securing lifelines, and pulling their wounded from the wreckage. But even their determination could not change the inevitable. As the fires finally reached the ship's magazines, a final, deafening explosion tore through its core. The mighty carrier shuddered, split apart, and began its descent into the abyss. The sea rushed in, swallowing the wreckage, and taking with it the last remnants of Japan's hope for victory at Midway. From the decks of American ships miles away, sailors and officers watched as the smoke drifted into the sky, marking the graves of the fallen carriers. The attack had been swift and devastating, an overwhelming success that no one had dared to predict. Cheers erupted across the fleet, but beneath the celebration was a deep understanding of what this moment truly meant. Japan had lost more than just ships. The highly trained air crews who had once terrorized the Pacific were gone, their expertise irreplaceable. The carriers, built with years of effort and resources, could not be replaced quickly. This battle had not just crippled the Japanese fleet, it had rewritten the course of the war itself. As darkness fell, the ocean was eerily quiet. The fires had finally burned themselves out, leaving only embers floating on the surface. The wreckage of what had once been an unstoppable force was now scattered across the water, a grim testament to the power of intelligence, strategy, and sheer determination. For the Americans, the victory at Midway was more than just a turning point. It was a statement. The era of Japan's dominance in the Pacific had come to an end. The path forward would still be long and filled with battles yet to come. But for the first time since the war had begun, there was no doubt. The tide had turned, and it would never shift back again.